Now, judgment has been reserved in the Constitutional Court in the case seeking to give unmarried fathers the right to register the births of their children. The Center for Child Law wants fathers to be able to allow to do so without the mother's consent. For more on this, we're joined by Anjuli Leila Maestri, who is an attorney at the center. Anjuli, good evening. It's a pleasure to have you on. Look, it's quite a contentious issue that you're taking before the Constitutional Court today. Perhaps let's begin with the context of this case. How exactly did this come about?
Right, so the context of the case arose as a result of the fact that many unmarried fathers were approaching the Center for Child Law and Lawyers for Human Rights and telling us that they were unable to register the birth of their child. And the fallout of that was really that the child became invisible and was unable to access basic rights. But the barrier to that is located within Section 10 of the Births and Deaths Registration Act. And that states that the notice of birth can be given under the surname of the father with the mother's consent or under the mother's surname. And so what ends up happening is that both of those scenarios insist that the mother must be present. But in reality, mothers are very often not present because they may be deceased, they may have abandoned the child, or they may be missing. And so fathers end up being unable to register the birth, and the child is the one who experiences very serious infringement of their rights.
Let's talk about the statistics and what they tell us about how many people on average would be affected by this.
Right, so one of the very tricky things about this is that there are no statistics because these children are undocumented. But the Center for Child Law and Lawyers for Human Rights has been working in this area for a long enough time to know that it is definitely a systemic issue, meaning that there are vast numbers of people that are approaching the Center for Child Law and Lawyers for Human Rights complaining of breaches of their fundamental rights to such an extent that the problems within the Births and Deaths Registration Act must be resolved.
So when we talk about the actual registration of the birth of the child, it really comes down to who the surname that the child is able to carry within that birth certificate.
Exactly. So that is where the barrier within the legislation lies. There was another barrier prior to this, but the history of the matter is, of course, that this was initially in the Makhanda High Court, and the Makhanda High Court resolved some of the initial barriers. But unfortunately, this part of the law still presents a barrier and wasn't resolved in the earlier cases. And this part of the law is the one that you mentioned, insists that the child's birth has to be registered under the father's surname with the consent of the mother.
Sure. So are you implying that this applies in exceptional circumstances, or are you looking for a court ruling that would mean that there is general application of that law to all South Africans?
Right. So it would be general application of the law to all South Africans, but of course it would only end up applying to a particular portion of our population, which is unmarried fathers who are unable to register the birth of their child because the mother is missing, because they're deceased, they've abandoned the child, they're disinterested, or they're missing.
So in the cases then where you do have both mothers and fathers who are unmarried, who are both equally interested in the well-being of their child, then what are the kind of legal scenarios that would present themselves in a case like this? Because, of course, in a country like South Africa, where many children are raised by single mothers, there are, of course, great contestations around issues like that. Whose surname do you carry, and why?
So this case doesn't actually touch on that terrain where both parents are present, and the barrier is because there's contestation between the parents. That is an entirely separate issue which the legislation and which Parliament must deal with. And does deal with. There are mechanisms in both the Births and Deaths Registration Act and the Children's Act that cater to that scenario. This is a very specific set of circumstances where the mother is not present at all, and so fathers become unable to register the birth, and the child remains invisible for many years of their life.
Sure. Any indication yet when the final judgment will be given out? And I wonder, what does this mean for children who've been born and their births haven't yet been registered because of this legal hurdle?
Exactly. The Constitutional Court hasn't given us any specific indication of when judgment will be handed down, but in general, the Constitutional Court, or any other court for that matter, wouldn't take more than 3 months. And in the interim, of course, you are correct. Unmarried fathers and their children specifically, because the issue concerns children more than it concerns the fathers, because it's their rights that are being violated. In the interim, until the Constitutional Court provides us with an order, this continues to remain an issue for children.